As the coronavirus pandemic took the world by storm, for the first time, many people in developed countries understood what it is like to lack access to essential medicine they need to survive. For people in poor countries, lack of access to medicines has always been a problem. This podcast explores the access to medicine issue and how we can promote global health more broadly. Famous scientist Marie Curie once said, "Talking is the best medicine." In this podcast, we will heed the advice of Curie and discuss how we can ethically and effectively tackle the health challenges currently affecting our world. Throughout this series, we will break down and explore fascinating new research being conducted by leading researchers and activists in the diverse field of public health who've dedicated their lives to understanding the problems and identifying the solutions to health crises that impact millions of people around the world. So sit back and enjoy this episode of Talk is the Best Medicine, brought to you by Global Health Impact Project in partnership with planksip.
Good day. This episode is a bit different for us as we have focused mostly on access to medicines, human rights, and global health to date. Helping people with access to medicines is complex. Medicines not only have to be affordable, they must, for instance, be available for people where they live, and getting vaccines and other medicines to people is particularly difficult in conflict zones. International Days of Peace have helped people provide some key medicines, for example, against polio, but conflict is one of the main barriers to eradication efforts. The world recently declared an African polio-free day on August 25th of last year, but the disease still exists in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it is only when the US finally pulled out of Afghanistan that the global polio eradication campaign was able to launch its final assault on the virus in the past few weeks. Moreover, we must do a lot to promote global health beyond providing medicines. People need the social determinants of health, which are food, water, shelter, and education for health, and they cannot suffer from extreme poverty or conflict that destroys basic health infrastructure. So today we talk with Leif Wenar about one of the causes of conflict and how we can address it. After receiving his A.B. in philosophy at Stanford, Leif Wenar earned his PhD in philosophy at Harvard, then worked in Britain, and returned to the Stanford Philosophy Department in September 2020. He is currently developing unity theory, a new theory of what makes for more valuable lives, relationships, and societies. He is the author of Blood Oil, Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World, and the author meets critics volume Beyond Blood Oil, Philosophy, Policy, and the Future. He is also the author of entries John Rawls and Rights in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
You have quite a repertoire and acknowledgement from your peers. Congratulations and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Great to be here, Ken.
Right on. Okay, well, I'd like to start off by having you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got interested in philosophy in particular, as it relates to oil. That would be very interesting. And what drove you to think about oil? I mean, I have some ideas, but I'd like to hear them from yourself.
I was just reading a book by one of my colleagues, and it had one paragraph which really mystified me. It said, look, if a gang takes over a warehouse by force, no one thinks that the gang should get the legal right to sell off the merchandise and keep the money. But if a gang takes over the government of an oil-producing country, they do get the right to sell off the oil and keep the money. And I just read that paragraph again and again, and I thought, can that really be the way the world works? Someone better look into it. Maybe I should look into that. That was 15 years ago now. And the next thing that happened is I went to Nigeria, a major oil-producing country in Africa, and I saw what oil can do to an economy and to a people. I asked everyone in sight, what's happening here in Nigeria? And everyone said, well, it's the oil, don't you know? And that was the process of learning that sent me on to write the book Blood Oil.
Wow, that's very good. It's much needed, I would assume. So let's get right into it. The article that you wrote, this is one that we actually want to focus on for a minute. I want to read a quote from The Oil Curse, Go Deeper. The West has intervened violently in oil-rich states for decades. Western oil companies have been shamelessly exploitative. Because of climate change, we should be getting off fossil fuels as fast as we can. Those things we know, but there is a deeper story to oil in world affairs that hasn't yet been told. Every day we are forced to send our money to some of the most ruthless men in the world, and by empowering those men, we endanger ourselves.
Let me say a little bit about that. And most of the book is about oil, but I thought since we're doing global health here, we could start with our phones. Think about your smartphone. In my phone and your phone, there might be a small piece of the Democratic Republic of Congo that was harvested by one of the ruthless militias there that have made the Congo an extremely violent place, one of the worst places in the world to be a woman. We might have the Congo in our phones, which means that some of the money we spent for our phones may have been going back to those militants to help them buy more bullets and bayonets and to continue the struggle that keeps the Congo so chaotic, especially in the East. In the midst of that chaos, as you know, it's very hard to provide people with basic health needs. And so if you look at the stats, the DRC vaccination rate for COVID currently is 0.1%. So in some way, just by doing something ordinary like buying a phone, we may have been sending money to the militants who are causing the chaos, who's making it harder to get vital medicines to the people of the Congo.
Wow. So that brings me up to my first point or theme here, and this is about being complicit. So can you go into what you mean about complicity, and what can the American people, or how can the American people be complicit for something that they aren't aware of?
Yeah, complicity is a big word, and I'm actually not that interested in finger pointing and blame. As it happens, what's going wrong here is something that's such an ancient rule that we all take it for granted, and it's not anyone's fault that we haven't noticed it because it's been around since, the great powers were blasting each other's wooden ships with cannons. What's going wrong here is a 17th century rule that we still have in global trade, and I can describe it very simply. America's rule, every country's rule for the natural resources of other countries is whoever can seize those natural resources by force will make it legal to buy the resources from them. So that's, for example, how we are in business with those militants in the Congo who have no right to those minerals except for their guns. They send the minerals through the globe's supply chains. They end up with us, and our money goes back to them because America's law, every country's law, really does say might there turns into legal rights here. That's what's putting us into business with the men of blood and corruption abroad.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then I know you weren't trying to focus on complicity there, but to me, there's a higher level complicity of our elected academic and political elite to act on behalf of the citizens, on a global stage. And it appears to me that the direction of your work is really pointing out a flaw in that, and a rather big gaping hole. So I think that's worthwhile work for sure. You state that the decisions made by our leaders, regardless of political stance, left, right, conservative, liberal, have legitimate criticisms, some more than others. What do you think is Do you think this is worth more criticism, going to liberate a country, or the decision to leave a country forming a void, right? I mean, Afghanistan as an example, for men with militia to move in and sell oil?
The problem here is not a party political problem. This is not something that the American party should be debating about. This is a problem that everyone should be wanting to solve, because what's going wrong with our law of might makes right? It's bad for the people in other countries, and it ends up being very bad for us too. And to see how that is, let me just talk a little bit about oil. The book is called Blood Oil. Oil is the world's largest traded commodity. It's worth trillions of dollars every year. Huge amounts are spent for the oil of other countries. And where does that money go? So when you fill up your car with gas, or when you buy anything that's made out of oil, like anything that's made of plastic, where does your money go? Well, as you can imagine, it goes often to many of the largest oil producing countries in the world. And this is where we see the oil curse. So if you look at the figures, most authoritarian countries are oil rich. Most of the countries with civil war are oil rich. Most of the severe poverty in the world, most of the refugees, most of the hunger. I mean, oil really does cause a lot of problems in countries that export a lot of it. And that's because, again, our law here, our law in every country says it's legal for us to buy oil from whoever can control the oil by force. So if there's an authoritarian regime in Saudi Arabia, or Equatorial Guinea, for example, in Africa, we say it'll be legal for us to buy from the authoritarian, from the dictator. And that's what sends so much of our money to the oppressive, to the corrupt, and to the violent men who cause so much trouble in places like the Middle East and Africa, which trouble then, as we know, comes back to visit us here.
Yeah. You know what? It's not really just a comment, but we do impose sanctions, and I think Iran is a perfect example of oil sanctions. But I think it would really depend on what kind of reason, right? So again, not really a question, just kind of pointing out that there is a mechanism to globally enforce things, but the concept of tariffs or this kind of thing are kind of contentious in themselves. So anyways, you bring up might makes right, a British law from colonial age, where if you control a natural resource, you can sell it. You bring up the example of a gang taking over a gas station in the UK. They cannot sell the gas to the US, but when Gaddafi or ISIS took over oil wells, we did buy from them. Again, just reiterating what you're saying. This seems like a scaling problem. Does it not? Is it just a matter of some sort of a glass ceiling that somehow has been shattered?
Again, this law has been in place for every country for hundreds of years, and it operates so naturally. We just take it for granted. Of course, we buy oil from dictators. Of course, we buy oil from armed groups. That's just the way it's always been done. But the key to seeing why it's such a problem is power. Oil is power, and it's an especially dangerous kind of power because it's entirely unaccountable. So say that you are an authoritarian in a big oil-rich country. You need money. And where are you going to get your money? Well, you could try to get foreign aid, but then, the people who give the aid put strings on it. Oil is better than that. There's no strings attached. You just get the money. Or you could try to get your money from taking out a loan from an international bank. But oil is better than that. You never have to pay the money back from oil. If you can just keep control over some holes in the ground, put a fence around the hole, put some soldiers. If you can just keep control over some holes in the ground, you get vast amounts of money, and the money comes in without any accountability to the people of your country. The people of your country could be uneducated, unproductive, sick, diseased, in the middle of a civil war. It doesn't matter. As long as you control those holes in the ground, you still get all the money you need to stay in power, and also, as it happens, to cause trouble abroad. So you mentioned Iran. Iran has been sponsoring militant groups across the Middle East for many years, obviously opposing American interests. You can think of Syria, causing the refugee crisis that went into Europe, bringing back Gaddafi's terrorism for all these years. Putin is another oil-funded autocrat who's been interfering in Western elections, invading a European country, and so on. So when we see trouble coming out of oil-rich countries, we can see the unaccountable, absolute power of oil at work. And in the end of the day, that's the money that we've given these men to use for whatever purposes they happen to think is right.
Yeah. I want to go back to the example of the gas station robbers. Okay. And, the laws of our land would quickly and decisively, get in and round those people up and throw them into our judicial system. From a risk reward standpoint, right? The riskiness of going internationally. This how does that play out, right? I mean, it does seem like there's a huge amount of risk for a global community, policing global community, which the role is usually falls on to the United States predominantly. They have to put Americans into harm's way. How do you balance that in your philosophical approach?
This project really does not want anybody to invade oil-rich countries. It's important to see why we've been doing it and why we should probably not do it anymore. So let me go back to this major point that oil is just power. Oil is unaccountable power. We send all this money to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, to Iran, to Sudan, to Russia, and the authoritarians there often oppose our interests. We give absolute power oftentimes to our enemies. That, when you see it that way, then you can see the West's strategy for the past generation as trying to contain the power of oil from the outside. So sometimes we invade, sometimes, as you mentioned, we impose sanctions, sometimes we try to make alliances with the oil-fueled authoritarian regime, and again, we end up sacrificing a lot of lives and spending a lot of money and damaging our reputation and not getting good results. How stable is the Middle East looking these days? And that's really a big deal. So we're trying to contain the power of oil from the outside. We can't do that. And when we invade, which people have different views about the wisdom of invading, for example, Iraq, my view is we not only spend a lot of money and lose a lot of lives, we damage trust in America internationally. And I think we all can agree that one thing that COVID has shown us is we don't have a lot of trust in the global system. And these big problems like COVID and climate would be so much easier to solve if there were more trust in big countries, which is the kind of thing that we can't further militarily.
I like that emphasis on trust. Probably something for another day's conversation, but it seems to me like the people that have the knowledge, i.e. academia, would be, very good to get into more situations like this where we can explain and educate and teach and show and build trust with the community. So anyways, you talk about abolishing might makes right, and you give examples like slavery and diamonds and how the might makes right theory for these items are no longer held by the global governments. In the case of slavery, the U.S. saw how decisive or divisive and difficult it was to get rid of. In the example of diamonds, I'd argue that this is a luxury item, whereas oil is essential and at this point. How can we make a smooth transition from might makes right to resources belong to the people mindset?
Good. That's the crucial question. We all can see that there's a problem with oil. It's causing all these difficulties, oppression, conflict, refugees, poverty, all of this. It's real trouble. And the trouble is coming from this bad old rule of might makes right, by whoever can keep it by force. There is a better rule that all nations have signed up to, at least in principle. So the better rule is right there, and everybody knows what the better rule is, and it's just the principle that a country belongs to its people. A country belongs to its citizens, and so the oil belongs to its citizens, and so no one should be able to sell off resources from a country unless they are minimally accountable to the owners, to the citizens of the country. If anybody sells off oil or minerals from a country without any accountability to the owners, then they're literally selling stolen goods. And that means that about half the world's oil that's traded across borders right now is literally stolen oil. So we know what the better principle is. A country belongs to its people. Oil power has to be accountable within the country, to the citizens of the country who are right on the ground every day and keep track of what's going on. That has to be the answer to solving the oil curse. And your question is so deep because it asks, how could we switch from this old principle of might makes right that we all take for granted to this new, better principle that holds the power of oil accountable within each country? And it's true, it will be challenging, right? This is oil. It's a big, big deal. And lots of powerful interests are invested in the system as it is.
It seems like your approach is even a first step, because I mean, there's a lot of environmental lobbyists and big organizations like the IPCC that are moving towards a more carbon-free economy. But your step seems to say that first let's address the ethical nations that are causing real harm, and that seems really. Would that be accurate to say?
So definitely, the best way of getting off blood oil is to get off oil entirely. We should be switching away from oil just as fast as we possibly can for the reasons of climate that we're all aware of. But as you say, we will be using oil for decades more, unfortunately. So this project is about, as long as we're buying oil, we shouldn't be buying it from authoritarians and armed groups. That's bad for them. It's bad for us. And your question is just how can we make this transition to this better principle that we should respect the rights of all people to their resources? And it really is nothing more than all of our countries changing their own laws. We don't have to send out a single soldier or airplane. We just have to change our laws here in America for who it's legal to buy oil from, who it's legal to buy minerals from. If we can change our laws here, and other countries can too, then the authoritarians and the armed groups will know that the time is up and they're no longer going to be able to get so much power from these kinds of natural resources. And I'm glad to say that some countries are already moving. So Brazil, the fifth biggest country in the world, leader of the global south, has legislation pending that would just ban any imports of authoritarian oil into Brazil. And they're also going to ban their national oil company from making more contracts with authoritarian regimes. So if Brazil can move on blood oil, maybe America could too.
Yeah, that's on a broader spectrum of oil. The idea of having oil go up and that affecting economies. This is going to be something that is going to be concerning for our political and electoral sort of. I guess our candidates, our politicians, are going to have a hard time with this because if there's any kind of austerity involved or loss of economy, it's going to be really hard when we have a competing, political party, standing there saying, "See, these are wrong for the people," and that seesaw effect. Do you see any of what's your strategy on that? Do you have any insight on that? I mean, it's such a big question.
It's an important question. And of course, when you go to Washington, D.C., that's the first thing that they ask you. Right? This is a great idea. How much is it going to cost? And all of us want to know the price tag for doing stuff. It's a totally natural question. Let me say one thing about why it's important to do this now, which is that we're about to face another energy crunch. You can see the price of a barrel of oil is going way up again. When oil gets above $75 a barrel, it's really trouble. So last time it was above $75 a barrel, 2007 to 2014. And there you saw the repression of the Arab Spring, and Syria, and Libya, and Russia invading, and so on. So once oil price goes way up, the authoritarians and armed groups get a lot more money. And I'm sorry to say, I checked the oil price this morning at $78 a barrel. So we're about to be giving a lot more money to authoritarians and armed groups. So how much would it cost to get out of business with them? There's enough oil already for not only the U.S., but all of the West to stop buying authoritarian oil. The best estimates we have is that getting out of business with authoritarians and armed groups would raise the price of a gallon of gasoline by 5 to 10%. So right now, that's 15 to 30 cents. Is that right? So this is the value proposition for the American people. Would you be willing to stop sending your money to authoritarians and armed groups and getting the stolen oil in return if it costs you a little more, 15 to 30 cents? And by the way, that'll be a little bit extra nudge to move away from fossil fuel cars and towards electric vehicles that run on the fuels of the future. I agree that this is an expense, but I hope it would be a manageable one.
That's very good to do that. But I mean, I'd also like to volunteer the U.S. reserves for the ability to subsidize it's actually really good that you put it to such a small number, because it's quite within our capability. I'm an acting American now. I'm a Canadian, but the idea that, the U.S. has so much oil reserve, it could easily accommodate that and instantly make the world a better place, right? And how can we lose sight of that?
And as you can imagine, Canadians are very much in favor of my proposal. There was one gentleman, a lawyer, a wonderful man, who bought a copy of my book for each member of parliament in Canada's parliament. I mean, Canada has a lot of oil, and so we would be using that oil. And of course, let me just say again, we should be getting off all oil entirely, but as long as we're using oil, we shouldn't be sending our money to the bad guys.
Right. Okay. So now you say that 98% of the world's population lives in a country that has signed a treaty claiming that resources, which is, in our case, oil, belong to the people. Yet we see many countries with dictators, as we've just been talking about, that do not show this. How come these treaties aren't being held up?
That's a great question. They are human rights treaties, and international law, I'm sorry to say, is not a very powerful regime. And there's many reasons for that. People just don't do what they have agreed to do. Many countries violate their human rights obligations. Many countries stand in the way of the enforcement of human rights obligations. It's a continuing problem, but the good thing is the words are there. With a lot of our campaigns, getting the ideas out is super hard, right? Think about all the big lists we've had in the past 40 years to make clear concepts like sexual harassment or modern slavery and so on. It's hard to get new ideas, but this is not a new idea. The idea that a country belongs to its people, that's just the idea of Gandhi, right? To be free from that's just the idea of Mandela, to get rid of apartheid. A country belongs to its people. That's a principle that people all around the world, when we poll them, already believe. So it's not a big lift intellectually. It really is just showing that it's in our interest to live up to our principles, as it's also the right thing to do.
Right. Well said. So you briefly address a few issues that could help with a transition into supporting leaders in the Middle East that are held accountable to the public. One issue that I didn't see you mention is the possible suffering by the peoples in those countries with leaders that refuse to leave. Imagine leaders being pernicious. If they're forced into something, it's like the hierarchy of the suffering. Well, I'm suffering, I'll make, but the suffering of the people in these countries with leaders that refuse to leave but can no longer sell their oil to foreigners. What is the best way to minimize the suffering of the people in the countries that will not transition or are slow to transition, throw up roadblocks? All the various different tactics, right?
So let me say something about the suffering that's going to happen if we keep on doing what we're doing. Because right now we are choosing to keep our law of might and right in place. And that is our law. We're choosing to keep it in place. And the resource curse really is severe. Let me give you another way of looking at it. If you look at the major oil producing countries outside the West for 30 years between 1980 and 2010, over those 30 years, those countries on average are no richer, no freer, and no more peaceful. From 1980 to 2010, 30 years, no richer, no freer, and no more peaceful than they were. So oil is really a problem for the people there. It's causing problems right now because of the laws we have. Switching away from those laws will cause problems. And let me just say, for anybody out there who's an activist who has a project like this one, if you really are going to be an activist, and if you're really going to talk to people in power to try to get them to take your proposals up, you have to be responsible. You have to be honest that some people will suffer if there's the changes that you want. The best question I've ever gotten for 15 years of giving talks on this topic is, would you be willing to be one of the people who died because of the reforms that you're proposing? And I think that's a question you should ask to everybody who comes on the show or everyone who gives you a proposal to change the world. This is really serious stuff. And if you're going to propose something like the way we trade for resources should be trained, you should be willing to accept that there will be costs. But let me say again, there are real costs for continuing to do what we do. We really are going to have to wake up tomorrow and have some rule for who we're going to buy resources from. If we continue to send our money to the authoritarians and armed groups, many, many more people will suffer and die than if we switch what we're doing.
I really like the way you framed the responsibility in that. And you paint that picture very accurately and very realistic. I think that's a really important buttress. So in an admittedly extremely oversimplified example of looking at a country that has put a lot of revenue back into social programs is Venezuela. And however, like due to mismanagement and probably various different other factors, lack of a fund for when oil drops in price, the drop in oil prices has led to an exploitation of the poor. This is, how can we prevent the leader that is very popular because they make oil their main export, and add stability to the country, and use that money to improve social services, but does not plan for the globe when eventually moving away, from oil? I mean, it's even assumed that they're not buying from the tyrants. It's still, how do you see that problem, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, for anyone who knows Venezuela, what a tragic story. I mean, people down there are suffering so much, almost unimaginable. You look at maternal mortality rates, nutrition rates. You even hear stories that, for example, in the National Oil Company, which used to be one of the gems of South America, incredible expertise. Sometimes now workers have to go up ladders two at a time to fix the equipment because the workers are so faint from lack of food that they're in danger of falling off, and the second person has to catch them. So Venezuela, in some measure, is the second biggest oil country in the world. It has a tremendous amount of oil. How could it be that this extraordinarily well-endowed country is suffering so much? That really is the oil curse. And the only part of the question I'd like to be careful with is, if you ask what should be done, my strong view is that what should be done is up to the people of Venezuela. It's for the Venezuelans to sort out what happens in Venezuela. It's up to the Congolese to sort out what happens in the Congo. It's up to Nigerians to sort out Nigeria. What we can do in America is stop making things worse. Stop sending our money to the oppressive and corrupt and violent men. We're stopping the people of these countries from doing what should be done, to take the oil money and put it into public goods. And let me just mention, you can see that public accountability really is the solution for the resource curse. The key to who gets the resource curse is this. Was the government accountable to the people when the resource came in? Because there's a lot of countries that have oil that are just fine. And those are the countries where the government was minimally accountable to the people when the resource came in. So Norway has a lot of oil. Canada has a lot of oil. The US has a lot of oil. Botswana has a lot of diamonds. In all of these countries, the government was minimally accountable to the people when the resource came in. And so the people insisted that the government use the money for public goods instead of for corruption and violence. How can we stop furthering the lack of accountability in these countries and support the people of the country by declaring we believe that the resources ultimately belong to them, and we're not going to buy from anyone who's not accountable.
That's a good summary. Good. Yeah. So when discussing the Arab Spring, you noted that countries with oil did not have a change of leadership, but countries without oil did. This point seems to imply that if we no longer buy oil from a country, that the country will no longer be able to buy weapons, allowing the people to revolt, possibly voluntarily. If we no longer supply money to a country for its oil, thus preventing them from buying weapons and oppressing others, how can we make sure that the situation in the country doesn't get so extreme that there is a violent revolution? How can we guarantee that the leadership would even change? North Korea does a great job of keeping power without the exportation of oil.
Sure.
A mouthful there, but
oil is not the only source of authoritarian power. It's a very big source. Most authoritarians are oil powered, but it's not the oil source. How does North Korea get its power? It's a little bit from taxes, but mostly it's not from the people. It's from aid. Like oil money, the aid money from China comes in, and the government doesn't have to be accountable to its people. So aid money is a bit like oil money in that it comes in without any accountability to the people. Okay, so what would happen if we didn't buy oil from the authoritarians? I'm actually pretty optimistic about this. There might be some countries where they got a really rocky transition, but all of these countries, for example, in the Gulf, have for generations been promising reforms. You see it again and again. When the oil price goes down, they say, we're going to give more power to the people, and there's going to be civil rights and political liberties, and we got a new constitution. And then the oil price goes up, they get a bit more money, and they put all that stuff on the shelf. If the signal really came from US, UK, EU, China, if the signal really came that they were not going to be able to sell their country's oil anymore, those old constitutional reforms would be taken off the shelf. There are reformers outside the palaces, and there are many reformers inside the palaces. We see that the day of the old ways have gone.
Are you proposing in that description a coalition of sorts?
This proposal will certainly work best if countries join together to stop buying oil from authoritarians and armed groups. And we can coordinate our standards. We have to coordinate who counts as a country that's under bad enough conditions that we shouldn't be buying resources there. Coordination is great. It's easy to do, but it doesn't have to wait for that. The US could move first, and other countries would follow. I mean, as in fact happened just not long ago, the US was the first to require its oil companies to be transparent about how much money they were giving to foreign governments. No one thought that anyone was going to do that. Once the US moved first, other countries followed soon. And now the US, EU, Canada, all these big countries are requiring transparency from the oil companies. And that's really encouraging.
Yeah, that is encouraging. It shows some progress, I suppose. You state something very interesting. The West cannot control the unaccountable power.
I'm sorry, Dan. We have a short episode today, so we can move on to the student questions.
That was the voice of God, apparently, that just descended from. So we're going to move on to the student questions now. So at this point, we'd like to ask some questions that were submitted beforehand by the audience, and just so we can get as many questions as possible, let's try and be concise, and let's start with the following. Despite widespread news coverage about the oil curse, oil is a part of our everyday lifestyle. Is there a way to realistically trigger a massive cultural shift away from oil? Can this reasonably be done in a short amount of time?
I wish there were a lot more about the oil curse on the news. I mean, I'm very encouraged about climate. I don't know how you feel. It feels to me like 2 years ago, it really was the tipping point when it came to public consciousness about climate in America. Before 2 years ago, a lot of smart people knew it was important, but it really felt to me about 2 years ago, major media, major corporations, government, political parties really started saying, no, really. We got to take this seriously. And now when you open the paper or turn on the website, you see it all the time. So that kind of thing really can happen. And I just have to say leadership is so important. These big structural things, leadership is so important. As it happens, I don't think our leadership's been particularly great in any big country on this. I think Greta Thunberg has been the greatest world leader when it comes to that. She's had the most impact. So normal people can really be leaders on these issues. Everybody knows now we do have to switch away from fossil fuels. They are 85% of our energy supply. All the infrastructure, all the filling stations, all the car repair shops, trains, planes, cars, buses, trucks, ships, everything's built around oil. So it's going to take us some time, but that just means that people need to demand a switch away from oil as fast as possible. And it's just the same thing that has to happen with blood oil. We really have to see it every day that when we go to the filling station or buy anything plastic, we're sending money to bad guys. And there has to be fear and outrage at that and a real campaign to get it stopped.
Okay, perfect. So, is it logical to say a promotion of electric vehicles would be a good idea to aid the movement to stop the purchase of these blood oils? I guess you'd have to know the materials in the production of the electric vehicle, right? And to your knowledge, do you know that that's compatible with staying blood oil free?
Electric vehicles themselves, of course, don't run on oil. They run on electricity, and that just pushes the question one step back. Where does the electricity come from? So if you're burning coal to get the electricity, you're really not winning by running an electric vehicle, right? Because coal is much dirtier than oil. If you're getting your electricity from natural gas, then you are probably having a climate advantage. And of course, if you're getting your energy from hydro, you're getting it from nuclear, if you're getting it from wind or solar, then yes, you're really doing a lot against climate change by having electric vehicles. There's another question actually about electric vehicles, which brings us back to the Congo where we started. I mean, some of the materials that go into the batteries come from the Congo. So that's a problem. If you buy a Tesla, are you going to be sending money to those militants again? Tesla, as it happens, has seen this problem and is trying very hard to develop batteries that don't have to rely on those particular materials. So, tough problems. We really have to keep at it. You have to keep at it all the time. If you're asking me, is it a good thing to buy an electric vehicle instead of a fossil fuel vehicle? Yes, it is.
Okay. The next one has to do with, I'll just read it. It says, would Americans exploit their own people and their own land for domestic acquisition of oil as an alternative? I think you got to get the example here is the Native American lands and oil pipelines. So I'm guessing what the question is that if the Native Americans actually want to sell the oil rights under their own autonomy, right? So outside of any kind of intentional coalition or something like that, right? Without stipulation.
So any American can sell oil because this is a country that is above the line of minimal accountability of the government to the people. I mean, we got a lot of problems here, but we're not the Congo. Right? If 100 million Americans tomorrow wanted fracking to be stopped, fracking would be stopped. And you can see that in New York, right? The people rose up, they demanded a ban on fracking, and fracking is now banned. So America as a whole is minimally accountable to people. It's not fantastic. There's a lot of problems, but minimally accountable, yes. And that means that the laws of America are the laws under which oil can be produced. Native Americans have some land under which they have rights to oil, and of course they can produce that oil too.
Right. Okay, so how could we create a sustainable version of principled action in the United States? For example, after the Iran nuclear deal was made with the Obama administration, the Trump administration immediately backed out of it. How could we keep consistency with our support of population owned oil and administration to administration? And feel free to use a non-American UK, for example, whatever, but sounds like you're fairly familiar with the US politics.
Okay. So let me just mention, I am an American citizen. All my education is here. So happy to be working here again. It's true that you have to have policies that will survive from one administration to another. And these are dramatic policies. The key to policy is it has to be across the board. We can't game this. We can't say that we're not going to buy from Iran, but we are going to buy from Saudi Arabia. Right? We're not going to buy from this place, and we are going to buy from. That's not respecting the principle that every country belongs to its people. So it's really dramatic. We have to say to our old allies, the Saudi royals, who rules in your country is none of our business, but right now you can't get any of our business because you're not minimally accountable to the people who own the oil. We're sorry, we don't have the right to buy the oil from you. And that's going to be a really dramatic thing. Once one president does it, that'll be a big sea change. And if people demand it, it will continue.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a good follow-up, I think. Are there actions in which the everyday person can do or change in their day-to-day life that may help hinder the increasing power and impact oil has on the world? Bad oil.
Yeah, you can definitely stop using oil as much as you can and go to renewables as much as you can. Stop buying plastics. A lot of people are talking about blood plastic. It's really true. Plastic is just oil. So those reusable bottles, just as bad as buying oil. On the website Clean Trade, I think we still have up our report on which oil companies do more business with authoritarian regimes. So we've got all the numbers, which is not easy. And we can tell you for BP, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, so on, how much of their profits do they get from doing business with authoritarian regimes? And if you want to switch away from buying oil from those companies and go to companies that do less business with authoritarians, that would also send a signal. So there are things that all of us can do, but at the end of the day, it really is up to government. This is essentially a problem with laws. Our laws are putting us into business with the bad guys, and we really have to change those laws.
Yeah, I have this one. I kind of know the answer to because I think there's an optimistic tone to your approach. But realistically, how can everyday citizens of the country? No, sorry, that's the wrong one. How might preventing the oil curse, help move the global health access to medicines?
Yeah, well, I can say a little bit about why I'm an optimist. Because the global problems seem impossible. And then something happens as a crisis, people plug in their thing and it becomes the new normal, and then we go on to the next crisis. About access to health, let me just spend a minute with Nigeria. If you get the book Blood Oil, you'll see Nigerian hands on the cover. And I'm really so happy to have put Nigerian hands on the cover because I learned just a tremendous amount from my Nigerian friends. Nigeria, as you know, is a gigantic country, 200 million people already. By mid-century, it'll be bigger than the United States in terms of population. COVID vaccinations in Nigeria, this gigantic country, less than 3%. This country has a huge amount of oil, just oil like you couldn't believe. Nevertheless, half the citizens live in extreme poverty. The country has 2% of the world's population, but 14% of its maternal deaths. A Nigerian woman dies every 13 minutes from preventable problems with pregnancy, and 1 in 10 Nigerian children dies before reaching age 5. 1 in 3 is malnourished. So this is the real paradox of plenty. This is the resource curse. What's going on in Nigeria? If you go there and ask, everyone will say it's the oil. The oil empowers leaders to be less accountable to their citizens. So if you talk to people who work for Shell in Nigeria, they'll tell you stories about one of the presidents not long ago sending $40 billion from the country's treasury with armored cars into this gigantic compound under his palace. $40 billion, right? At the time, that was as much as Larry Ellison, who ran Oracle. So that's a lot of money going into this underground bunker while women are dying in childbirth and children of that country are malnourished. More transparency, more accountability. What can we do here that would help Nigeria? That's what we should be focusing on. Should we be in business with the most corrupt officials in that country?
That's a great summary of what the problem is and kind of how we can move towards something better. So that's really good. Could you imagine something like a fair trade label for oil, or like that? See, the Global Health Impact Project right, proposes something similar for medicines from companies that have had a large global health impact. The same kind of labeling for for certain oil countries, or do you think that would work?
Yeah, we looked into that, and especially under Professor Hassoun's encouragement, because the health impact model is so powerful. It turns out, as great as the model is, you can't do it for oil because the oil companies won't tell us where the oil comes from. So just as it happens, if you're interested, these big tankers come in from foreign countries. They put all their oil into the refineries, and then it all gets mixed up. And then it goes out to the gas station. So they won't let us know where the oil comes from. We tried to do the next best thing, which is we did trace where the oil companies are getting their profits. And that's where we can tell you who does more business with authoritarian regimes. So if you want to, we can't tell you where your oil comes from, but we can tell you where your money goes. And if you want to keep money away from the companies that are doing more business with authoritarians, we can help you with that.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. And before we go, I'd like to offer a closing message. And is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with? As I said, it seems like you've done such a nice, last couple summaries. But go ahead if you'd like to, as an encore performance. Is there anything you'd like to say to the audience about your work and the direction that you're hoping to go?
Oil today is driving some of the world's worst problems. We should stop making it legal to buy oil from authoritarians and armed groups. It's bad for them there, and it's really bad for us here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us today. And we'd also like to thank our sponsors. This podcast series is a part of an Epidemic Ethics WHO initiative, which has been supported by FCDO Welcome Grant 214-711/Z/18/Z. I'm your host, Daniel Sanderson, and I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of Talk is the Best Medicine.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. To find more of our content or explore the exciting work being done by our parent organization, the Global Health Impact Project, you can check out our website at global-health-impact.org/new in the description below. The Global Health Impact Project hopes to continue to support efforts like this podcast to provide information about and advocate for access to essential medicines. Also follow the Global Health Impact Project's social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time, don't forget, talking is the best medicine.